All right, thank you. So first thing to say is thank you very much for coming to my session. I'm actually overwhelmed by the amount of people here, so thank you very much because there's so much to see, and I've already seen some great sessions this morning. So I hope with this presentation there'll be something interesting for everyone, but I would like to foreground a certain context. So just to begin, my name's Jodie Bradford. I work at the University of Leeds, so I've not had to travel as far as many of you have yesterday. And it's lovely to be here in Warwick. It's my first time visiting the campus. So this presentation is all based around a couple of studies I've done over the last 3 years, really. It started with my master's dissertation. I did a master's in MAT, and I did a dissertation. Very lucky to have been working at Leeds as I was doing that. And then I've taken part in some scholarship this year, and I wanted to share with you some of the points of discussion from that, rather than going through in a linear fashion what I did. So to begin, I'd like to foreground my context. So I'd just like a show of hands to sort of figure out in the audience how many people here are currently working in international foundation year studies in any capacity, as a teacher, module lead, even administrator. Yeah, and I know that foundation in itself has many different contexts too, so we've got quite a few in the room. Everybody else, don't worry, I also work with PGT, I work in sessional as well, so I'm hoping there's something for everyone, but these studies were also having a focus within that kind of pre-undergraduate context as well. So I'll introduce a little bit more about that before moving on to my points of interest over the last 3 years, in particular to do with sometimes writing's invisible partner, reading. And we all know that reading is absolutely central in all of our students, no matter what stage they're at in their academic journey. And I thought it merited a little bit more attention. And particularly when I heard some of the kind of deficit narratives coming out of my students' mouths in foundation year. So I'll explain a bit more about that. And then some of my points of interest and underpinning theories. I won't go into any depth, but there are some areas here that I'm still reading around that I'm trying to kind of uncover a few different ways into reading, especially for foundation students, but for all students. And maybe the part we're all here for, some teaching examples, suggestions, and discussion. Of course, as ever, it's an ongoing endeavour for all of us. So, to start with then, my EAP background and context. So a couple of points of focus for today. I'd really like to emphasise academic reading as social interaction. I'm hoping this is not too controversial. By this, I mean that I want to move away from reading as navigating an object that's static, unmovable, representing a piece of information that's stuck in time. I want to move into academic reading not only focused for an academic outcome, purpose, assessment in particular, but also thinking about the ways in which students use reading in their whole academic lives, and not just in the semesters of foundation year. So just looking at these ideas here from these two authors, if we can all accept that reading is much more than decoding vocabulary, so one of my first points of problematization was my students saying, these are really difficult texts. Yes, they are. It's because I don't have the technical vocabulary. Part of the story. There's a little bit more than that, and how we're going to help students make those conceptual links between texts. Reading is socioculturally located. I'm sorry, but I don't think skimming, scanning, reading for gist is enough. I don't think read the introduction, the conclusion, navigate the subtitles is enough. What else can we do to help students link text? So these were my starting points. So my international foundation year context, as I said, as we all know, very, very beginning of the HE trajectory. Of course, our students are arriving here from all around the world. Our students, I'm not sure if it's the case for everybody, very, very diverse cohort. So we have students that have taken international baccalaureate, some that appear very, very confident. Oh, miss, I can write an essay, no problem. I can do that, no problem. Others that are very lacking in confidence, all within the same room. And I think all classes, you need levels of differentiation, but I've noticed it's quite pronounced, at least in our international foundation year context. So over the 3 years, I've worked with IFY STEM, but my focus at the moment is around IFY Arts and Social Sciences. So I want to draw out a couple of these disciplinary differences as well. Of course, extremely broad areas. So we're not talking, at Leeds we have some very bespoke work at PGT level. At Foundation, we used to have a very general EGAP module. We now have 4 different modules: IFY STEM, IFY Arts and Social Sciences, IFY for Business, IFY for Medicine and Healthcare. And we provide the core 40 credit module that fits in with the other modules for the pathways. So I hope that makes it a little bit clear, a bit clearer, the context that I'm working in and these ideas came from. Okay, so we've established that students at Foundation will need to read more than bus timetables and restaurant menus. They're going to have to read some very difficult texts and to start to make links between those texts and mapping those concepts. So I want to start today with a little bit around multimodality that I was reading around and then noticing, particularly in the lockdown period. So 2021, we were fully online in different workspaces. So I was reading a lot around intertextuality and interdiscursivity, and I think our students have a lot of trouble. So I've mentioned Varsha here in making those explicit links between, as I'm going to start with, STEM texts. So I'm going to show you how we tried different activities to help students get to that stage of being able to map concepts and make those links between the texts, rather than seeing them as separate, you know, kind of non-related, and not being able to pick up on those conventions. And then this year, I've been working with Arts and Social Sciences students, and I've been trying to actually focus in on a very expansive theory that I'm still reading around, full confession, but it's one of the EAP knowledge base theories, systemic functional linguistics. And I've been quite encouraged by other colleagues outside the institution, various blog posts and other more recent reimaginings and recontextualizing of SFL. And so I've started to apply, and this year I wrote a suite of academic language workshops around reading to fit in with the syllabus. So I'll come to that after. This is not the focus today, but eventually, of course, students do need to write assessment genres, but that's for another day to discuss. We're really focusing at this kind of foregrounded part of reading, and not just reading for an assessment outcome, but also reading as part of their academic lives and journeys. Okay, so moving to part 2, I'm going to show you some examples here as well, and thinking about multimodal approaches. So of course, when we're all kind of stuck at home doing lots of online teaching, reading a lot around multimodality as an approach, thinking about the ways in which language is a resource to communicate, reading a lot of Kress and Jewett. So if we can kind of agree that learners need to integrate language-related competencies. So yes, grammar as form, but also much more complex systems of sociolinguistic discourse-related competencies with that multimodal literacy. So we're not only working with our canonical genres anymore, we're also thinking about the ways in which those genres are complemented, and then there's all sorts around kind of intersemiotic complementarity between genres. I'm going to show you how we start picking this up with students, just the very beginnings of noticing that hopefully they can take with them as they go through their journey. So, a couple of questions for us to think about. Again, it's all born out of my frustration of reductive reading strategies, I'll be honest, and then students doing themselves down with saying, I don't know the word, therefore I don't understand the text. It's much more than that. So how can we, as EAP practitioners, help students to approach conceptually difficult reading more meaningfully? So this is more my kind of STEM examples today I'm going to show you. And then this one, how can we recontextualize certain elements? So it's huge. We're not taking that theory off of a page and taking it into a classroom. We're trying to almost pick and mix little elements of that. So my project this year, I made a suite of workshops and I interviewed a couple of students around that. So without going into too much detail, I'm going to show you kind of discussion points that came out of it. So these are the two kind of questions we've got here. Okay, so just a bit more now. These theories are huge, as I said, but these are things that are guiding my ideas as I continually grapple with what makes a meaningful syllabus for foundation year. The good thing about foundation year is the whole year. It's not a 10-week course. And so you do get to build that rapport with the students as well. So back to reading. Reading as I said before, social interaction, meaning making. Can we use elements of SFL and social semiotics to underpin our multimodal approaches? So I'll get to how that looks with concept mapping after. This idea of discipline, of course, IFY is very broad, but I still think IFY students deserve more than navigate this text using the subheadings, look at the introduction, conclusion, read for gist kind of stuff. So trying to move beyond those strategies and recognize them for when they're useful and when they're not. Thinking of language as a social semiotic. So again, language, it's not in stasis, it's continually developing. If we can kind of instill that idea in our students, I think that we can actually make reading more meaningful. So rather than you need to read this for this assessment, try to think about what the author is saying, why they are saying it, and as I'll show you later, which language choices they're making. Okay, and yeah, so we did focus in, I'll show you one example after, on lexicogrammatical choices in the text that they were reading as part of a syllabus. So this year with IFY, I actually changed the topics to hopefully be a little bit more integrated into their disciplinary trajectory. So, for example, I used identity and society as an overarching topic in semester 1, and then intercultural communication, interculturality in semester 2. So, with the help of some colleagues, I'd picked out some texts. So, in the language workshops that I will show you after, the texts are not just presented to them in a kind of bolt-on fashion, they've been reading them throughout the semester. So it's not a kind of, okay, look at this decontextualized piece of language, it's part of the meaning of the whole semester, and part of the reading that they're doing. So a little bit of an interlude here, back to STEM. So now thinking about multimodality and the way that IFY STEM students were kind of taking in this reading. And these two quotes stood out to me, so I'll just let you read those two. So I think what is important to observe here, for example, this one at the top, S3A, he's aware that outside of the text, the linguistic repertoire, the images are really important. Of course, graphs, charts contain, well, the key information in a IMRAD support report, for example. But in a textbook, images take on a very different meaning. So this student has started to pick this out, but he's also recognizing that for him as a reader, actually I need to really kind of take into account that different resource and the different semiotic meanings around the text. This one I thought classic, yeah, so she's heard about strategic reading. People tell me to read the intro, conclusion, move on, see what's useful for you. That does serve a purpose, but we've got to recognize that students actually want to go a bit deeper with their reading and actually are really quite unsure about these brand new genres. So how are we actually using them meaningfully rather than just saying, navigate this piece of knowledge and information? So, as an example, you probably can't see this, it's quite small, don't worry. So this ended up in some concept mapping. I think we all know we can use different apps for visualizing, but in order to lead up to that, remembering that this is the first time students have seen these kinds of texts ever, in the most case. So we were looking at the IMRAD structure with STEM students. Some of my colleagues here will recognize this. So we really kind of separated out that different multimodal resource, made guiding questions to help students really notice, okay, yes, rather than the graph being incidental, you work that out yourself. What is it doing within this text? What does it look like on its own? What is it recounting? Whereas room 2 would be looking at the linguistic resource underneath and around. Room 3 had some prompts to help them with the information in the text contained in the abstract. And then they would come together and discuss. And then, crucially, they would do it with a second text. So it's this idea of making sure that we're doing justice, I think, to making those links between the texts and helping those students to see them, to uncover them. So, discussion at this point. How am I doing for time? Okay. Okay. So, of course, disciplinary differences, of course, lead to different multimodal reading priorities. So I've just quickly shown you a little bit of STEM. I'd like to move on to IFY Arts and Social Sciences and why I started to choose elements of SFL to help us with that. I think as EAP practitioners, we're here to help students develop not only kind of reflexive approaches, depending on their purpose for reading, why they're doing it, what the writer's intention is, but also that kind of metacognitive one. So that is something that's ongoing, that it's not there for a restrictive purpose. And I'm sure many of you have a similar experience that students are just thinking beyond the next week into the assessment. I think we can help them to come out of that kind of siloed thinking in a way, to help them with their undergraduate journey. So not forgetting as well, all students have such rich access to such multimodal resources. It's not just about those canonical genres anymore, like the IMRAD report. What kind of visuals and audios can we use to help those students to unpack and unpick and deconstruct, of course. So I think, again, remembering this pre-undergraduate level, we're really talking about raising awareness, raising curiosity, establishing, hopefully, more multiliterate critical readers. I know I'm running out of time. I'm just going to quickly show you this sort of next phase here that I mentioned at the beginning. So working on a project this year with Arts and Social Sciences students. So a syllabus, of course, language is contained in the syllabus, but I felt often it was a little more incidental. So I decided this year that we would actually have some language workshops as part of the syllabus. So I used SFL as an underpinning. As I say, it's huge theory. It's not picking that on the page and putting it in the classroom. So I'll just very quickly go through. I was inspired by a colleague's blog post, in fact, speaking with other colleagues, thinking about how applicable this sort of thing could be in the classroom. So remembering that language is a resource for meaning, that we can actually pick this up in the classroom and look at whole text, paragraph and sentence level. And so that does provide a kind of systematic frame. And so this is how I kind of designed these workshops. With Arts and Social Sciences students, I kind of put in about every 2 weeks, working with the text they were working with in the rest of the week, working towards their final assessment of, at the moment it's an annotated bibliography, assessed seminar discussion. And I wanted to show you a little example from our workshop 3. And again, I think people in the room here might be experts in SFL, so I'd really love to hear your thoughts on breaking up the meta-functions. But in workshop 3, we really focused on language for interaction and engagement. And I did use a little bit of meta-language with the students. So each week we looked at a comparison between 2 texts they were reading, whole text, paragraph, sentence level. We had a kind of table with some prompts to help them uncover and notice the ways in which language was used. In this case, we were looking at interpersonal language. And again, going back to that language choice that the writer's making and how are they relating ideas within their field, their discipline, their topic. Okay, so we always come back to their context of foundation year. Many of my students doing the arts have to do reflective portfolios. There's always the discussion around personal pronouns. I was in Olga's session this morning, that came up again. This is again my example. But we try to think about not just I or we, using them, not using them. A lot of my students' module tutors will say avoid I, and these are sociology tutors, so that's quite interesting. So we have a discussion about why that might be, and then in their assignments, where would they be more likely to use personal pronouns? And yes, we're looking at expert literature here, but we've got a book chapter. It's actually taken from second language pedagogies. David Block uses a lot of I. So we look at the different ways in which he uses I, why he might be using them, and it's a book chapter, an academic text. What has he published before? What is he kind of trying to get across as a knower in that area? And then we've got Sichimorang. It's a small academic article, a study on the use of elf in Indonesia. And there you don't get any personal pronoun use, but you get a lot of inanimate subject and verb use. So we pick apart that language, have a look at not just what it is, but also why the writer might be using it and why there are the differences between this particular book chapter and this particular article. And it's very important to say this doesn't mean this appears everywhere. Starting to get students used to that ambiguity in language. Okay, so that's just a little example. I think I'm almost out. Yeah. So just as, again, this is the start of my journey. I really welcome discussions, thoughts. I know many people are using elements of theories to underpin from the EAP knowledge base. And I really want to talk more about foundation year. There's a lot of focus on PGT, quite rightly. It's very important. But I'd love to talk more about this level as well. So these are really, you know, it's not for students to become expert in language description. It's to start to notice communication in their own discipline base. It's necessarily broad at this stage. Okay, so again, it's trying to spark that curiosity. It's not just read this, absorb the information, do the exam or the assessment. It's really trying to, I guess, you know, create those habits of mind and ways of thinking about reading and what the writers are communicating or not. So, some suggestions. I think we're really well positioned to promote academic reading as social interaction, so not just for restrictive outcomes or a product, that we can quite explicitly address awareness of intertextuality, so that explicit linking, not just with citation use, or kind of counting the number of citations, but also those ideas as well, which is more linked to interdiscursivity, picking up on, and yes, foundation year students have had lots of education beforehand that's not irrelevant. So how are they interpreting that reading? And hopefully we can unpack social functions a little further by using some of these meta functions, which I very, very quickly showed you some examples of there. And again, just to highlight that very beginning of their academic trajectory. So I will stop there. I have some references. Any discussion or question points? Thank you very much for listening.